tell me what's going on with you. Like now that you're a PhD, like what type of study do you think you're going to be going into next?
Oh, good question. So I am actually in the early planning stages of a study similar to my dissertation study. So
Hmm.
my dissertation study was on risk factors for injury in college swimmers. And a friend of mine and we recently started an athletic performance company. Um, his name's Akil Piggott. He's a physical therapist in New Jersey. And he and I are kind of working in that gray area between rehabilitation and performance. I'm sure you can identify with that area as, having worked in the clinically before or in a typical clinic and now being more private practice where you just have the freedom to go between those two worlds.
Yeah.
So he had been frustrated for a long time with the notion that you see somebody for a half hour or an hour, you're working with other people. Let's say it's an ACL injury. At 3 months, their impairments are resolved and you have to discharge them, but they're not ready to return back to play, right? And that kind of that dead zone can get very projected if somebody isn't being really proactive about doing exercises that you're prescribing them, or like seeking out additional help from a personal trainer or strength coach, or somebody who's well versed in that return to play aspect. So we started this company and we've been doing assessments on these types of athletes. So athletes who've been cleared from PT but are still having like nagging or lingering side to side asymmetries or pain, or just not feeling ready to return to sport after 9 months or 13 months or whatever it is. And so in a traditional PT setting, you are kind of just tied to, well, I only have an hour with the person, so I can only assess the things that I think are going to be very relevant to the issue. So if it's a knee, we're going to look at the foot and we're going to look at the hip, but we might not look at the shoulder or whatever. And so in our new context, we're doing these assessments that are going for like 2 hours, or we've done some that are even 4 hours, just trying to think about anything that could possibly be impacting this person from a movement perspective and from a performance perspective, and giving them just a full body workup, to be able to say, okay, here's what your strengths are, here's what your areas for improvement are, here are some ways that you could work on those things. And whoever they go on to work with, a personal trainer, a strength coach, they could hand off our assessment to that person and say, here were the results of a really in-depth assessment that I did. Feel free to use this in the programming that you do for me. So the long story short is that we started that company and we're trying to do a little bit of proof of concept from a research standpoint. So just looking further into what the evidence would be for some of the tests that we've been using in that setting in a larger group of college athletes. So we are trying to plan for a January data collection actually at University of the Sciences, with basically because their fall sports have been postponed to the spring, everybody's going to be starting their competitive seasons, or at least that's the plan right now, in the spring. So we're going to interface with the athletic trainer there and the strength and conditioning coach there and try to get some of this testing in January prior to the start of their competitive season, looking at performance measures and movement measures and seeing what associations they have with injury in a broad swath of sport athletes who play different sports. So what I did for my dissertation was just with swimmers, and this is going to be a more general thing, just looking at all, probably just non-contact injuries, but non-contact injuries in all types of athletes.
Cool. A couple things to piggyback off of there. One of the things that you're talking about, the time you get with people, that's one thing I've just found so interesting now, and it's been quite some time since I've been out of like the traditional clinic. But anytime I take a continuing ed course now, it's just funny how I look at things differently. Like I prioritize like the assessments a lot different than I did before. Before, you just be like, I don't know, I'm not gonna have time for that, so I can't even think about like
Right.
how I would use that.
Anything that takes longer than 10 minutes, you just can't do.
Right. So I wouldn't even like think about it now when I take continuing ed stuff, because I know I'm going to be one-on-one with everybody, and I have people that have been seeing for years. So it's almost like I have to find more different things to do to spend the time and show somebody something new. So I get kind of excited about stuff, even if it's going to take time. And the more thorough it is, it's almost like the better. And it's just interesting, like how my brain would almost be shut off to that with a type of present, or like if I was in a clinic where I didn't have as much time with people. So it's just that the world changes if you're in a different environment, and like your whole profession can change if you're in a different environment.
Yeah, and I've often thought about that with something like the Y balance test. It's a nice test. It looks at a lot of different things all at once. You can compare side to side. But if you do it the way that the research tells you to do it, you need like 6 practice trials per leg, per reach direction, which if you honestly do it and give the person the rest, it'll take at least 10 minutes, if not 20 minutes probably, if you're going to do all 3 reach directions. And so in no world in a traditional PT setting is that feasible. And so what ends up happening is you either don't do it or you do it, but you're not giving them the practice trials that they need. And so you're really just still on that learning curve before they plateau to what their best performance would be. And you're not getting the type of validity that or reliability that you need if you were to retest them later, because the second time they do it is going to be better than the first if they haven't had that time to learn.
Right. Yeah, and I have the Y balance test, and I'll say, like, with that, I've probably only done it like strictly twice, because the other thing that comes to mind is like, how much do you actually need the numeric data, and how much is just the movement, introducing those reaching movements themselves, just going to be something novel to the client, and then it just becomes very obvious when they show improvement. So if I have somebody that's an athlete, and the one time where I really was strict with it, actually, it was part of somebody's ACL protocol to get back. Like a surgeon was really into that type of data. So I made sure that I had the data as strictly as possible.
Have to train for the test.
Right. But anyone else that really doesn't have an interest in, they're not an athlete, or they just don't really have an interest in anything with like the FMS stuff. It's just taking like, what's the value of that test in itself, and then actually having some exercise that's similar to it to build up those qualities. I end up rarely using the Y balance test, but I use exercises that are similar, and you could see, just like anything else that you would progress in a fitness training perspective, you can see movements like that become progressively better, and a lot of things are getting better at the same time.
Yeah, you know what? I gave something similar. Where the Y balance is kind of a single leg squat with the reach, I gave a client recently, it was more of a Romanian deadlift, but I was having her reach in 3 different directions. I forget, there are a couple ways you can do it, because you can kind of reach with the arm or the torso, but she got to the 4th week of it, and just yesterday she emailed me and she said, I did it. I had her go in a triangle. Oh, you know what it was? I was having her tap cones, like medial, anterior, and lateral. And she said, I did it for the first time without having to touch my opposite leg down in between like a round of 3. So she was able to maintain balance the whole time. And that's kind of something where with the Y balance, the rep doesn't count unless you return back to the start position under control, because otherwise, you go to your limit, but if you've gone a little bit past your limit, then you're not demonstrating control if you can't get back to the start position. So that just reminded me, like, that's an easy way. It wasn't a reach distance thing, but just the ability, the balance and the ability to maintain the balance after, I don't know how long it takes, 30 seconds to go through that triangle 3 times. Like, I didn't need to measure her distance or anything like that to know that she's getting better at that test. If that's, if the balance, being able to sustain the balance is something that we're interested in working on.
Well, and one of the things that sort of surprised me is, as I got more into working one-on-one with people all the time, was I thought, all right, I was going to have more time to do these assessments very strictly, but what you realize is a lot of times this is based on normative data of like big groups, right? So like a Y balance test is awesome when you are looking at a bunch of people like on a team, and then you're taking that data over time and you're seeing like what's the score that tells that someone's ready to return, and to see if that data is actually useful. So you need to churn the data and then study the data. But when you're just working one-on-one, a lot of times it's going to be such a N is one type of situation all the time that to go real specific with that data is unnecessary. But the broad categorization, I think, of what that assessment is looking at is really valuable. And the FMS they've done the FCS now, which I went through, and that basically do that. They take these broad categories, they take a piece of the Y balance test, and they call that motor control, right? You're assessing motor control, and then they take explosive power, and then they have an assessment for that. They take postural control, and they have an assessment for that. And then they have impact control, and then they have an assessment for that. But just that idea of broad categorization, I think, is huge. And then that's something that when you have just like your one-on-one client, where you don't really need to go nearly as deep numerically with some of these studies, but you're just making sure that you have something that you can assess progress with in those big categories. And you can oftentimes you see a lot of progress. You also are just introducing people to stuff that they don't think of as part of fitness. And it just makes you feel like your program's a little bit more complete. And then you can have more freedom and flexibility to just fit things into those categories. So it doesn't look like it's the same thing all the time. It's just, I'm making sure I'm touching these categories.
Yeah, and I think, and we've thought a lot about that too with our assessments for our company, where we don't just want to look at somebody's movement quality we want to also test these measures of performance. And so that's where I think the FCS does a good job of identifying what those qualities are that we would want to assess in somebody. But that's also where I think a lot of the people who are very just married to FMS style things miss the boat, because if all you're looking at is how they do these unloaded slow movements, and you're not looking at that higher end of the continuum of like your movement to your performance to your sports specific skill. Like the FMS has their pyramid. I think that's great.
Yeah.
But if you focus too much on the SFMA or FMS stuff for an athlete who needs to be able to do the impact control, the sprinting, the whatever else they're looking at, I think you have to be considering those things as you're trying to, in a rehab context or a performance context.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I just think it's the more courses I take, it's sort of finding where are the commonalities and maybe creating a term around that, right? Like creating a category around that so that you can really fit it into whatever population you have. Like you're more versatile than when you have a more general idea that you're working under, as opposed to a more specific, right? Like the more specific you get, the harder it will be to transfer from, a general pop client to, a higher level athlete. But that's one of the things I originally found attractive about the FMS, or just that company, the stuff that they were bringing out, is that they were starting to categorize stuff in a way that I thought was actually quite useful. And I've told you this before, I thought when I liked the FMS a lot better than the SFMA, because the SFMA was almost like going back to PT school for me, where it was just like too broken down. And then it wasn't time. It didn't save time. It really, the categories were just like too broad, or they were too specific. So it was like, I wasn't feeling like I was making anything easier, right? It wasn't simplifying the process. It was just doing stuff that I felt like I already learned in PT school. And I liked the FMS because it was a little bit more like, there's only 7 movements, but then really there was just categorizations of like mobility, stability, and then 2 different types of stability. And I thought that was like, that's very useful if you can kind of have that there. And then you take what you already know and you can fit it into those categories.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I was asking Akil, my business partner, what like whether he ever used the FMS stuff clinically or versus the SFMA, and what he found to be the differences. And he said the opposite, is that he found the SFMA very useful and he hardly used the FMS. And maybe that was just kind of, maybe he liked the systematic and kind of very, very methodical, but also in-depth way that the SFMA did things. And beyond that, didn't find the FMS to be that useful. But and the reason that I had asked him that was my gut reaction when I discovered that because I was first introduced to FMS and then introduced to the SFMA, I thought they're just trying to make twice as much money by having two courses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they say this is for rehab professionals and this is for movement or performance professionals. And that's kind of a distinction they make to be able to have two things. But I hear just as many rehab professionals saying that they use the FMS when that's not what it's necessarily designed for.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just trying to get a better understanding of what the intricacies were behind the differences between those two things, so that because I've done a lot of like presentations on the FMS and I'm less familiar with the SFMA. So
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting to hear your perspective, given that it's different from the other perspective that I've heard.
Yeah, and and I've heard the other piece that, like, when I've had students that are, younger than I am, and it's like one of the first things they've taken is the SFMA. They find a lot of value from it, and I think it depends on how much else you have in your toolbox already. And I felt like I almost needed the FMS because I had done, all of the Maitland certification. I'd done all of the McKenzie stuff, and my head was in that world a little bit, which was very useful. And those certifications are very category based as well, right? So McKenzie stuff is, everybody thinks of it as just extension based, but it's really just repeated motion assessments that give you categories. And the categories are dysfunction, derangement, and then postural, right? So they break it down to three things. And, Maitland stuff with mobilization does a lot of the same thing. And it's just finding, like, is somebody stiffness dominant, somebody pain dominant? So there's all of these broad categorizations in these models. So the FMS I felt like it was just an addition to that, but what it did was it allowed me to look at movement more broadly. And I felt like the SFMA almost went the other way again, right? Which I think was the idea of it. But I didn't feel like I needed that, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like I'd already come from there.
That makes
and
a ton of sense.
FMS was taking me the other direction.
Right. So if you're fresh out of PT school and you're looking for a good system for assessment or evaluation, the SFMA provides that. But if you have already gotten a lot of that from PT school, but also the content that you've done, the FMS is a different lens for looking at things. So.
Right. Yeah, and it definitely helped me, and maybe this is just the way that I learn, because I also tend to move a lot, and I would consider myself a kinesthetic learner. So understanding the broad movement, which is like what everybody wants to get back to anyway. And, nobody really wants to do great on an FMS. That's not like anyone's goal, but just at least starting with that conversation of, like, people want to be in the gym squatting, they want to be, pressing, they want to be doing push-ups, they want to be running, right? They don't want to be like doing banded shoulder external rotations. They don't want to be isolating different things. So I like starting from the thing that the person's actually having trouble with, like the complaint, and then being able to deconstruct from there. And I felt like that was the start of me thinking along those lines a little differently, along with CrossFit and Kelly Starrett's work, where CrossFit was awesome, because I just thought of that as like all of these movements that I'm learning, but they had a process to learn, right? Like, everybody looks at everything being mashed together in a WOD, but it's really like, without the learning of the individual movements, then you're not really doing the WOD. So, and that was so much more, especially when you get in a setting where you're actually in a box, that was so much more than the actual hour was. It was learning the movements, and then the last little bit was sweating, right? And then taking that, which can be unorganized, and then having Kelly Starrett's model, and this is when I'm maybe probably like 10 years ago now, when I was introduced to that. I'm trying to think what year, like a good 8 years ago till I was introduced to that. So it's older stuff now in my head, but it was brand new, and I could see how he was also connecting it to some of the things I already was proficient with. So a lot of his banded mobilizations were based off of Australian or New Zealand based physiotherapy, like Mulligan techniques and Maitland. You could see it in his movement. So I was just like, oh, that makes so much sense. But you're doing it in the pattern that's so much closer to the thing that people give a shit about, right? And I think that was what was really valuable, and it was also giving the stuff that was hands-on. It was giving it more of a self-care type of spin, which I thought
Yeah.
was also huge. And it really was great for me because I had therapists that could work on me and things like that, but I didn't really want that. Like I wanted to be able to do it on my own so I can get the training and come back to it. And I just saw how practical that was, right? So it was definitely a mind switch. So that combination of things was great. And the more you add on to that, I don't think it helps it. I think it actually, for me, it would jumble it up. And the SFMA kind of did that, where I would rather just have these archetypal movements that I'm just trying to understand more and more about, instead of trying to break it down eventually to like single joints again.
Right. Yeah. And for all the flack that Kelly Starrett gets, I think the 2 points you raise about the kind of the work that he does resembles the movement pattern that you're after, right?
Yeah.
And if somebody can see like, oh, I'm gonna do, I don't know, whatever voodoo flossing or band this or that, like to my ankle in a squat, it's pretty clear how that's going to translate into a better functioning ankle in the squat. So
Right.
just the idea that it's obvious what the intervention is trying to improve. I think that
Yeah.
that can improve the person's buy-in, but then also the idea that they're able to do these things themselves and they don't need to rely on somebody else. Like it's pretty clear that from a rehabilitation standpoint, improving the person's self-efficacy, locus of control, all that when they have pain, like there's a lot to that. And he was probably 5 years ahead of the curve with that.
Yeah.
Despite maybe some of the explanations that he gave in Supple Leopard not being
Right.
up to snuff with the current understanding of pain science.
Well, yeah, and I think that the other thing that's difficult is the more specific you get with these models of movement, the more open you are to being not necessarily wrong, but there's just another way to look at it, right? And I know even just writing my own not popular book, it was like when the hardest part, the stuff that I felt least confident was when I started to dive like deeper into anatomy and biomechanics, because I've taken so much stuff that's just explained in a slightly different way. And there's always this, it depends on context. And when you write that as like a general rule on paper, you're really putting yourself out there, and it's easy to be criticized. And just going through Bill Hartman's model, I mean, it is different, but it's not foreign, right? It's tied into some other things, and oftentimes it's just a language thing. And you may be describing like hip rotation in one way, but it might be the opposite of what you mean, but the movement is still the same, right? Like you would still have somebody do the same thing. You would still, in many ways, cue them in the same way. But when you actually break down the dynamic nature of how things are moving, it's like what it looks like internal rotation can become external rotation and then become internal rotation again, right? So, and it matters on, are you actively breathing in or are you actively breathing out, right? So all of those things matter in a dynamic context. And when you write a book, it's more static, right? And your rules and and that's what people want too, right? That's what makes you like people popular a lot of times, is having simple guides. So it gets difficult. And I think like I kind of get that with Kelly, and I've also listened to a lot of his longer form discussions. And I did right from the get-go because I was like really interested, and I could tell like he was a deeper thinker than a lot of what he was just putting out there that was like making him popular. So and I can also see, like, I knew he was coming from that model that I was already familiar with of the Australian manual therapy and things like that. So it is difficult to be too specific, and because like the body just doesn't work that way. There isn't really like these biomechanical rules that hold all the time, and that's why there's all these arguments about it. I think discussions often need to be had, right? Because you have to ask, like, okay, in what context are you describing this? And then it can be, a different thing, and it can be different depending on somebody's compensations over time, which is another, like, there's optimal, what we would say, like, we want optimally, and then there's like what people actually do because of different structures, different shapes, right, et cetera. So that's hard to write in a book where you're trying to be simple, and especially for an audience that's supposed to be more for a gen pop.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about that too, because a friend of mine, Jenny Rawlings, and I are starting to work on a book. And inevitably, when you're writing something for a general audience, you're trying to think, okay, the average person who's going to be reading this, if you know who your audience is, let's say for us, it's a woman who's 47 years old and has been practicing yoga for 5 to 10 years and is interested in learning to strength train. So I can write a program for that person, but inevitably there's going to be some people who are 25 years old and some people who are 60 years old, and age being just one factor, and movement history. And so to be able to say, this is exactly what you should do to, if you're a beginner, or and then there might even be some people who aren't beginners. And so now it's like, well, I'm writing this program for beginners, but you're a little bit farther along. So for the first month, this is not going to be a waste of your time, but it's not going to be exactly what your starting point would be if I were writing this for you. So just trying to figure out, like with the explanation and with the recommendations, what the optimal, because you can only write one thing, right? Or you can only explain it. You can explain something multiple ways, but to make it simple enough, here's how I'm going to explain it. Here's what I'm going to decide. And it's going to fit the bill for this percentage of the people, and the people here and on other sides of the extremes, it's not really going to be quite right for, but that's what you get when you try to do something on a group basis or something for a larger population. And then in a one-on-one setting, you can get into all of the nuances and all the specifications.
Right. Yeah, one of the things I found valuable with Zoom sessions and not being able to be in person for several months was like really respecting program writing as like a starting point for people, right? So instead of having, all of this educated conversation, which is going to go over people's heads, and it's more probably for just hearing myself talk than anything, it's just like, okay, like we'll do a little bit of that. I want to make sure that people understand where I'm going. But even if people don't get that in the moment, just given a program and say like, start here, document that you're doing it, and then ask questions about it, right? And then we'll modify from there. And just having that be the basis, because every session can be a little bit different, and every person's going to be a little bit different in their interest in being educated. But the program is always the action, right? It's the thing that you want to get people to do, and you have to sort of try it out a little bit before you feel like you realize like if it needs to be adjusted for someone, if it's just right. But just getting that as like first or second session, that you have some type of standard that you're practicing, and then that starts to stir up conversation. But it also feels like it's just much more structured. And the longer you work with people, the more you vary those programs. But I think I was just doing so much of trying to educate on movement quality, and I was kind of varying things up too much when I was seeing people, because it was just like people get bored in a way, but I think I was really just getting bored, or I wasn't trying to go out there and just give people programs and see how it took, or I wasn't even telling them it was a program. Like I was doing it on my own, and they were just coming in and they would start to recognize, oh, okay, we've been doing this. On one day we do this, and another day we do that, and we're progressing with it. But actually to make up like a spreadsheet that someone has to keep track of and document, and then I can add to that, and I can do videos, and I can put content to it. It really just adds a bunch of stuff that I wasn't getting when I was just in person all the time.
Yeah, and I think I had long been guilty of that with like, because I've been doing the online thing for maybe 5 years at this point, and it's tough online because you don't know exactly what you don't see the person move ahead of time. I mean, I guess you can, but I don't really do that. I just kind of talk to them and say, all right, what's your injury history? What's your movement history? What's your exercise? Like, what have you been doing lately? And I try to just take what they have been doing and put my spin on it. But you can, there's a tendency like, oh, I want to make this perfect for you, so
Right.
that when you do it the first week, everything's at the right level, the weights are right, the complexity is right, the timing's right. And after a while you realize like you're never going to get it perfect. So just be, letting the person know that this is not set in stone. This is a working document. So you're going to do it the first time. You're going to tell me how it goes. And some things might be too easy and we'll quickly progress them. And some things I might have screwed up and they might be too hard, and don't feel it's my fault. It's not your fault that you're struggling with this thing. I chose the wrong thing. We're just going to work backwards, and we'll get to
Right.
that thing next month.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been big. And I actually have had 2 athletes that I'm just doing like true coach programming with them. And I mean, I don't really need true coach. I could be doing it on Google Sheets, but I just was exploring true coach, and they haven't come in at all. We haven't really had much communication, but they've just been following the program and, making great gains. And I think especially for athletes, that works really well because they already have that kind of structured model. And then, I'm there to answer questions about something being achy or sore, and being there for adjustments. But a lot of times it's the program that does the work. And it's similar to what we were talking about before we started recording about like when you have the virtual learning and now the parent is in the home with the child, they feel like they can't leave the room, where it's like, well, that you would be not in the room if you were in school. It's when you're constantly one-on-one, you don't feel like you want to just let people go with their own program sometimes. And you feel like you have to almost micromanage everything. And that is actually like a difficult thing, because some people will feel like, well, what am I paying you for? Right. And if I'm just standing back and just basically having them do the program, it doesn't seem like they're getting as much use out of me. And there might even be a risk that I got to do something beyond just having them do like a normal routine, or I'm going to lose clients and things like that. So this was good because I could see how I can actually add value just by having more of that structure. It's not like I'm not going to do anything. It's just now I actually have more structure in what I queue and what I think is important for this person, instead of just, over queuing.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. Like on 2 fronts. One, like you said, if you're there with them in person, they're looking for you to encourage them, correct them, provide them with some sort of novelty every time, or at least that's my perception of what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I need to ask people better what exactly they want. But I do find oftentimes, like, if something looks good, I'm not going to necessarily say anything, and then they ask me, how does this look? And it's like, well,
Yeah.
I should have just been more, certain people just want to hear that positive feedback.
Right.
But when you shift it to this asynchronous context where they're doing the program, you send them videos, they're doing the program, they might be sending you videos back. There's a lot of learning that takes place for them, as they go from set to set with that. And that's just intuitive, right? Like they felt
Right.
that you needed to make this correction. And I think that probably sticks better than me telling them something, like if you figure something out on your own. And then just the idea that it is necessarily maybe going to be a little bit more basic, because you're not having to provide that novelty every time, but that basic nature of the program might actually be more beneficial for them than the latest and greatest nuance to add the kettlebell in the left hand while you're doing the row in the right hand. Like,
Right.
just separate the row and the press, and
Right.
simpler can be better.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how to take the complex and make it simple. Because I know what I have a tendency to do sometimes is try to explain the totality of where I want people to get to eventually, and then I will try to eventually bring it to, all right, here's your first step, and I think there's some value to that, but I can lose people just even in trying to explain that. And I think it makes sense to me, but it might not make sense to someone else. Where instead of actually going through that description, just say like, this is what we're starting with. Someone asks me why, I'll just give you, well, maybe I can explain where we're going with it, but I could also just like give them a little bit more simple answers. Like we're trying to work on the first part of a Turkish getup. It could just be, I want you to be able to rotate to that arm, or I want you to eventually be able to get up off the ground. But it doesn't have to be this like mastermind explanation and say, this is where we're starting, but this is where we're going to get to. And the program is just sort of like, all right, this is just your core exercise, or this is an exercise we're trying to promote rotation. Because as much as that type of language gets sort of poo-pooed by people that are deeper into the game, it's what you need for the people that aren't, right? It's what you need for your clients. And I know that like the more continuing ed I take, it's like there is no language that's safe anymore, right? Like you can't say core, you can't say functional, because everybody's got a reason that it's not right. And it's like, and I get it. I do. I get the, where they're coming from, but I also think it's sort of like, it's a little bit like, okay, it's just language. Like your language is just language too. Like whatever you're saying is right is just your way of defining that. So you have to be more flexible with your language, right? And say what you mean by core, but it might be different for one person because they have a context of already what that means. And that's just the simplest way to get them to do what you want them to do.
Yeah.
And I think people get a little bit like prideful about their language. And I certainly can get that way, especially after taking courses and it's fresh in my head. It's like, oh, that's a curse word to say, functional or neutral spine and that kind of stuff. But it's, language is only a thing if it's useful to communicate to someone, right? So.
Yeah, and I felt like I was writing a little blurb for somebody else's article the other day, and I was describing how to do block pulls, so deadlifts like elevated on aerobic steps, and I found myself trying to pick the right word between like a lordotic spine, a neutral spine, or a flat back.
Right.
Realizing that none of those things are I might perceive that to my naked eye, but I now understand that there's kind of going to be some flexion in there all the time, like regardless of how flat it looks. So, but for a 3-paragraph explanation of how to do a rack pull in this article for a general audience, like the complexity wasn't necessary. So one of my peers might read, so I decided to say flat back because I felt like that was the least offensive of all the terms.
Right.
That's more of a visual, what do I see? But like realizing that some of my peers could read that and they think, he thinks that somebody's maintaining lordosis in the entire deadlift and that's not happening. It's like, well, I know that, I do know that, and I recognize that somebody who also knows that might read that and think that I don't know that, but for the 98% of people who just need to know the basic of this for how to perform this, like this is the word choice that I need. And if somebody wants to give me flack, then I can explain why I chose that.
Right.
Speaking the audience's language or speaking the reader's language or the client's language in terms of core and functional, like, yeah, those are really bastardized terms in our industry, and we love to argue about them. But if that's what's going to make the most sense for the person that we're talking to, let's just use that word. It's okay.
Right. Well, and you see like a lot of writing in fitness is about almost creating your own language and terminology around concepts that are already utilized. And I think that that's fine, but it's certainly going to lead to confusion, right? And so, anything that you talk about it, you have to make sure that the person you're talking to is on the same page, and you have to be able to define it if somebody asks you to go a little bit deeper with it. And so it's just, to me, it's about intent, but yeah, I find that it's so like, I'm almost on the defensive sometimes. The fresher new content is, the more careful I am with saying something that would be like old language. But I feel like you never want to let go of all the things that you learned, right? So it's not like you just learn this new language and this is more accurate and this is right. It's you have a broader language then that you can use depending on the person. And I think that's part of clinical expertise as well, is just to be able to know what's going to be the right term here. How much do I want to explain to someone? And, I'm finding it more and more common that I'll get people coming in for an initial evaluation, and I can tell like right away what I want to be working on, and I just got to shut the hell up. Like I really just got to start the process. Like instead of doing an explanation of what we're going to work on, like I just got to like get people moving, and then within the movement, then I can start to explain why I'm having people do stuff. But a lot of times it's difficult because, you know, people are coming loaded with so much stuff that I've learned a different way, or even almost an opposite. And it's just like, I feel like I have to break a mold that I might not have to break yet. I just might have to show someone a new exercise and then answer questions as they come. But it is, you know, interesting. It's like the more you get, the simpler you have to be, and it becomes more difficult to do that.
Yeah, and I kind of like of course I love to explain things and probably over explain sometimes, but I often like to, like, let's say somebody comes in and says, oh, it hurts when I bend down, and so we want to do some graded exposure to flexion. Well, I might not tell them, hey, we're doing graded exposure to flexion. Let's say we're doing a bird dog and they touch their elbow to their knee where they're getting some flexion in there. It might actually be better not to tell the person that ahead of time. So because they don't know that that's flexion, because it's not what they perceive as painful is when they're standing and they bend down to touch their toes or whatever, putting their shoes on. But if we can do that in a way where they're not quite thinking about it, it's more automatic, we just tell them to do this. Maybe afterwards I'll say like, hey, did you know that when you did the elbow to knee, you actually went into a little bit of flexion and it didn't seem to bother you? So there could be a context where you would want to explain all of that ahead of time, or there could be some context where you would just allow for somebody who's more fearful or more kind of overthinking it, like kind of not trick them, but maybe trick them into doing something where now after they've done it, you can explain what they've done, and
Right.
and that can be a good way to violate their expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's, I think with pain stuff, that's huge, because the more you know there, you realize education is important. That's what the evidence is showing, but the how of that is so different depending on the person. Like, so I just finished taking the Explain Pain course, and I'm glad I did. And I've been really into their work for a while, and it was great. There was a framework there, but a lot of it was just, based on the person. There certainly wasn't a protocol, and there's not going to be a protocol, because people are unique, and pain is not this really well quantified thing. It never has been, but we've tried to make it, quantified with structural issues, and that, it's great when it works, but when it doesn't, you're left with a ton of people in chronic pain, right? And they're barking up the wrong tree in many ways. And one of the things that I think also there's like a misconception of, if you're able to provoke somebody's pain through like a movement of a joint, then that means it's the problem with the joint, right? Like pain provocation is not the same thing as looking at somebody's x-ray or MRI and saying like, that's where the problem is. Like, pain provocation is one of the most reliable things, I think, in an assessment, of saying like, this is where your particular pain, you're reporting it to me, comes on, and now that's important. We'll be able to see that with your movement patterns. But I've heard, just the idea that, well, if I could provoke someone's pain, then that means that there's some type of structural damage that's underlying that, and that is not the same thing. And I think that is also a misconception that you see. So then, like, what gets kind of mixed up is that, well, all we got to do is talk to people, right? Like, and like, pain is sort of like in people's heads, where that's not true. We just have to figure out, like, literally, like, don't be afraid of pain, use it. Like, use pain, but don't think it's the same thing that you saw on the x-ray, right? Because there's no evidence of that. But the more you use someone's pain and you get them to feel comfortable, understanding where the edges and the corners of it, it becomes very valuable, and it actually becomes very reliable too. And I just think there's just so many like misconceptions there. So yeah, if you can get people just to move and show you right away, like where are you uncomfortable moving? Because if you get into a subjective conversation for too long, people will tell you that everything is a problem until they're actually moving. And then it becomes more obvious that, okay, well, like, so everything except maybe this angle is okay right now, right? And it is just interesting. It's like we can talk too much, but they can start to monologue too much about their history, and that just leads to, well, now I feel overwhelmed as a therapist. I don't know where to start. So all right, let's see, let's get you moving, and then it becomes a different conversation.
This is something interesting that I read a paper sometime last year about symptom modification, and the idea of, okay, we found the painful range of motion or the painful movement or the if you hold your arm this way and do this, it hurts. But if we can modify it, which I think is the Mulligan sort of thing, like, well, let's have you protract the scapula and then lift your arm, or retract and then lift your arm, or I can give you some assist and find a way where it's not painful. But then I was also reading that, so the idea was, well, if we can symptom modify and give them a way to do this movement pain-free, let's say in the first session, you would think, well, we've found a way to do it pain-free, so their outcome we would expect to be better just because we identified the problem. We found a way to modify it temporarily to allow them to do it without pain. But then what I recall was that the people who, there was maybe one or two studies where they did that, they found people who responded to a modification in the first session and people who didn't. And the hypothesis was that, well, the people who respond to the modification in the first session, they're going to have better outcomes, or they're going to be out of pain more quickly. And I don't think that was actually what they found. So as somebody working with somebody, let's say in a clinical setting, you might feel really good saying, we were able to modify their pain on the first session. I feel really good about my ability to be able to help this person get out of pain and quickly. But maybe if you look at that research, you can say, well, actually, I don't necessarily need to get the person out of pain in the first session. Even if I'm not able to do that and modify, I can still help them get better and quickly. So
yeah, and I think I've taken a lot of coursework where it was about symptom modification being kind of a guide to what direction you want to go.
Right.
And I think that still can be valuable. And there is, the McKenzie evidence is a lot of the theory behind McKenzie is not proven, like the biomechanical theory. And that's what I think people sometimes have issue with. But the idea of the categories of like centralization, if you centralize someone's symptoms, it's a good thing, right? If you peripheralize it, it's not a good thing. That's what the evidence tends to show. So it'll tell you what direction to go with somebody. And then you have to kind of follow up there. So now you actually have like a framework. You're not guessing, but there's so many ways to modify someone's symptoms. So I don't think it's so much about like that needs to even happen in the first session, unless it's just a way to build rapport, right? Build trust.
Yeah.
But what I think is more important is that somebody doesn't think of the symptom as something to avoid, to find dangerous.
Yeah.
It's real. And this is, the whole language around explain pain is, it's not pain, it's danger, right? It's not a pain signal, it's a danger signal. And threat, those terms I think are more important. So the more you can have somebody appreciate the usefulness of pain, then that's a huge deal, right? So demonstrating to someone that they actually have they have less pain than they think, just by showing it only hurts when you get here. Not that I'm necessarily going to take that away right away, but just saying like, this is actually where your pain is with movement. Not that it hurts when you move your arm. It hurts when you move your arm here. Like just making that a little bit of a smaller place, because in someone's head, it might feel broader. So you have to kind of show that. And I do a lot less of the symptom modification now, because I don't expect that I'm going to make much change that's useful early on. I'll look at different range of motion stuff, but I really just want to get a sense of the like low hanging fruit of like the movement stuff that people are limited with. And most of the time I want to keep it out of pain, but I want them to be able to have like this continuum that they know where their pain starts, their onset, and they know a path to be able to get there by doing something that they may not have done before, right? Because if they're doing stuff they've done before, they're likely just going to do stuff they can already do. Most of the time, their body needs to be able to do something it can't do, which is a slightly different process. But without the idea of tying that into somebody's symptom, it becomes like, again, this conversation that doesn't seem meaningful to the person. So as soon as you're saying, okay, like shoulder, this is as far as I can go and this is where it starts to hurt. Well, instead of just stretching into it and jamming it up there, how else could we look at the body to decrease the load there over time, right? Like, and what aren't you good at currently, right? And that becomes, I think, a little bit more obvious, right? Like you can't, if I'm just even having a conversation with someone with breathing, a lot of times I'll get, oh, that seems very counterintuitive. Okay, there we go. We have to have a conversation about that. All right. So, and sometimes that might take a little while to like just tell people that there's a possibility that you could breathe another way, and that has a connection to your shoulder, right? But without the idea of saying like, how far can you go right now? We don't have like any type of common ground of what they're trying to go to and what we're trying to do. And then that becomes your overall assessment. It's not just that, yeah, it hurts. It hurts where, it hurts when, it hurts with what, right? And it's surprising to me how few people, when they've been in pain for a while, think along those lines. They just think, I'm not better because it's still there. It's not, it's better because I can do everything except this. It's still there, so I'm not better, right? And like a good clinician needs to be able to show them only the things that they're having trouble with, and demonstrate also the things that they can still do well. Right?
Yeah, well, that's like a huge empowerment thing, right? Like people think, oh, well, it hurts when I do this, so I can't use this arm. And now I started using this arm, and this arm hurts too. And it's like, hold on, like actually look at all the things that you still can do that aren't painful, and just that process of exposing them to those things can sometimes alone help to reduce their pain, because they started doing more things because they weren't fearful of it, right? They started to do more things that you showed them that they were able to do, and that can have a cascade of positive effects.
Right. And the other thing I think is tied into that is, especially within physical therapy, it's become such a isolated, joint type of profession, or at least it had been. It certainly was when I came out of school, and I think it's changing quite a bit. But that mindset is still there in a lot of patients that have done a lot of physical therapy. And when I see people that have had a lot of previous therapy, they are in the mindset of like, something hurts, I have to do stuff like that's very specific to that area.
Yeah.
And the concept of just like improving the broad systems of your body is just, it's like beyond them. It's a difficult sell, right? So like just improving your aerobic capacity is probably going to have more value on your pain than anything you can do specifically at a joint, right? If you really think about it, right? Because what are we trying to do? We might be trying to decrease hypoxia. We might be trying to improve overall, health of the tissues, right? So doing things broadly will often have more positive effect on especially chronic pain than anything that's specific. And the same thing with, the nervous system. It's like we're talking about the nervous system and like trying to, maybe we can glide some nerves, and I'm a fan of the movements that do that. But the conversation around making it be very specific, I don't think that's a great conversation to have. I think it's just like we have to look at the nervous system. It's like how we think, how we respond to things. That's our nervous system. How we feel, how we respond to temperature, like all of those things. So it's just like we want to involve the whole body as much as we can. And it's very directly related to what the person has an issue with, but it's that the mentality is so much like, I don't need that. I just need to focus on this, right? And it's, and then you'll get when I start talking along those lines, you'll get the term holistic that comes up. I like the holistic mindset, but I think we just need to focus on this. And it's like, no, it's not this like esoteric term it's just like it's working the system of your body that's literally going to make the change that you need. Like if you're looking at pain as this mechanical thing, then it's hard to get out of that mindset that the other stuff that's going on within your body has an effect there.
So I definitely hear that. I definitely have those conversations, definitely hear from people who have been, like you said, been to a lot of PT before or dealt with docs who were kind of ingraining that thing like, oh, if it hurts here, there must be something structurally wrong there, or just if it's a shoulder pain, then we need to do these shoulder exercises with the band for it. And so do you often struggle to, I don't know if convince people is the right word, but get people to buy into when you're talking about breathing, when you're talking about walking for shoulder pain, right? Just that more right holistic approach. Is that something that you ever get pushback from? Like, oh, I just want you to tell me what to do with my shoulder from a shoulder exercise standpoint to fix this.
I do, but I think it's depends on how I come at it, and that could be different day to day. Like, to be honest, and it's just something that I just might misread a person or something like that. If I am able to read it right, or like kind of go through and demonstrate to them, like, okay, this is what your limitations are, and then this is where I don't even describe it as breathing right from the get-go. It's like I have to get your rib cage to be able to move, or I have to get your shoulder blade, which is part of your shoulder, to move. Well, here's the ways that we can move your shoulder blade, right? Like we can, and I might show them cars or something, like we can move the shoulder blade this way. The other part that we can affect is how we move the rib cage, because that's right where the shoulder blade is. And really the only option we have for that is being able to control your breathing mechanics, right? And that's, or at least I say that's the most useful. So if I find resistance, I try to switch quickly. Like I don't want to butt my head into the wall, because you're not going to get everything your first session anyway.
Yeah.
So I've had that quite a bit, where it's just like I have to veer quickly because I can see people are getting frustrated, and then it's just like, okay, what's the first shoulder movement that I could do that goes in the direction that I want them to go, that'll make sense. And so I'll veer there. And as far as stuff with like gait, I will bring that in if somebody has an issue with gait. I will talk more about like aerobic exercise in general, and then I'll give people the option. And I think that's an easier thing to discuss a lot of times, where it's just, if people want to do that anyway, like most people want to get more fit, but just to describe that, like, this is going to be really important for you to just feel like anything's going to be less painful. Like if your body is in a better state of circulation, pretty much, then everything will be a little bit more desensitized. So that, like, I think that's a little easier conversation. Or it could just be like, let's get you on a bike here before we do other things. Let's get you warmed up right before we start to stretch you up.
Yeah, that's one
context.
I mean?
Something along those lines.
That's one context that you can. We're gonna go do your 5 to 10 minute warm up on the bike. They don't necessarily realize that they're getting some aerobic training in, even though that's the effect that you might be after. But to them, it's just warm up, and it is warm up, so it's kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yeah, and in my clientele at this point, is I have people I've been seeing for like 5 years, and then I have some people that will come in and I'll see them like once, and I just have to realize that like the people that are new, that like I'm really not going to get good results unless people come in consistently, right? And I don't think any of us are, unless again, we can give people stuff to work on their own, and they're that type of client that's really good and diligent with that. But because the process has to be ongoing, it has to be over time, I think it's more useful to just keep the first session less aggressive than I want it to be, right? Like less information than I would typically want it to be, and just say, like, if I don't see this person again, then they're not going to get the most out of the work. But if they come in, even if it's like once a week or just periodically, and then there's some type of model to move forward with, that's actually going to be a better solution than trying to give them all the information at once, right? Because it's not going to take. But because I have like such a contrast where like the people that I see consistently, I have no problem, you know, patiently educating them and knowing like the people that, you know, that are interested in the education and the ones that aren't, and I have time to make adjustments, you know. But it's the new people, I feel like I want to give them all the information, and it's just like, well, if they don't become somebody that's coming in consistently, it's not going to matter anyway. Like you just can't make fixes, or you can't make changes, especially to chronic stuff, in one session. So I think, you know, you'll end up scaring people off more than actually getting them successful if you try to be too complex in that first session. And that's something I'm constantly learning.
Yeah, well, you know, there's definitely the tendency, they come in and they're telling you how they're leading your life, and you're like, well, I know you're not sleeping enough, I know your nutrition's
Yeah.
off, I know you're not hydrating enough, I know you're not doing enough aerobic exercise. If you tell somebody that in the first session, they're just like paralyzed and overwhelmed. So, but if if you know that this is going to be a one-off thing, what's the right amount of information that you can give them, that they have direction when they walk out the door, and that you have made the biggest impact that you can make in one session, which is, we know it only is so much, but if you try to give them too much, then they actually get less.
Right. Yeah, and ultimately, like the initial session is a marketing session, really, and even in healthcare, where you want people to come back, and it's not for your benefit or the benefit of your business, it's
you
for
can
their
help them,
benefit.
yeah.
Yeah, but you have to sell something that they feel like they want to come back for. And I know, like, trying to do too much, that's when I feel like I've done the worst job, is when I try to do too much, and I just haven't, you know, seen eye to eye. Like, I haven't given a good action plan. I've just given people a lot of information, right? And I just, you know, it's weird because I'm almost rusty with new patients sometimes, because I have such a, you know, a book of people that I see regularly,
Yeah.
that it's like practice every time I get a new person. It's like, don't do too much here. Don't do too much here. And videos help though too. Like, where if I feel like I've had a session where it took me a little while to figure out like what's going to speak to a person, and then towards the end of the session, I feel like, all right, I've given them a couple exercises to work with, but I really wish I would have been able to summarize it better. That's when I'll just do like a video summary. And then that becomes something that I feel like more comfortable with. And then, you know, that ongoing conversation, like, feel free to text me. That's the thing I love about being one-on-one is, you know, if you see somebody in a group setting, or like you're seeing 4 people at once, like, you don't get a chance to redeem yourself a lot of times, because it's just like people won't come back, and you don't really have that relationship usually where you're talking to people once you're out of the clinic.
Yeah, and I love that about, like, when I've referred people to you, or when I've come to you, like, getting the video to be able to watch anytime later. Just like, if we didn't do that, I would definitely have forgotten. You might have forgotten.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
then like the work that we had done during that hour, it's not lost, but if you can't continue to practice it, then it's not going to be as good. So yeah, I appreciate that's something that you've implemented, and I don't see a lot of people implementing it the way that you do. So, and I get the sense sometimes that some of the things that you post are maybe some, like, in general on YouTube or social media or wherever, whatever, are probably things that you're recording for other people, that you're just kind of making general so that you could share that information with other people, or have it to refer people to later. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes. Sometimes. Absolutely. And then there are times where it's like, do I want to make this more personal to the client, or do I
Yeah.
want to make it more general?
Yeah.
And you know, it's like today I had an example. It was just like, I had to do a video as a summary. It was like, this could be like a broad conversation, but at the same time, you know, there's always very specific cues that you're going to get that first session because of somebody's injury history or something like that. And I may have to give them a specific cue that I don't want to have to explain broadly, right? Like, why I'm telling someone to go to their left heel instead of, you know, like, just squat. So, and and that's where it'll be like, all right, well, it's not content. I'll do something that's more general at some other point. But when it fits in that general type of education, and I try to make it like I don't say the person's name, and it's just for movement professional, and then that just becomes something I can systematize a little easier.
And use that for a later patient who has the same issue or article that you're working on, or yeah. I mean, eventually you've answered all the questions and you don't have to do anything ever again. You can just say, go to this YouTube video.
I'm desperately trying to systematize
or buy my book. It's all in there,
Right. I'm desperately trying to systematize. And one of the things I've definitely gotten a little bit more diligent with is if I send people videos of exercises, I'm sending them my videos, and I'm not just sending them like the first one that pops up on a Google search, just because I want to have like that. I want my clients to feel like, okay, that I'm doing something outside of just the time that we're together. And I've also done a lot of stuff, and sometimes I just get lazy with just sending like the easiest thing that is going to get the point across to what I want them to do, instead of finding the stuff that I may have done years ago that just might as well send my video and or make a new one that I'll use over and over again. So just because there's one person after the other, and sometimes after a long day, I don't want to even have to think about making another video. But I'm trying to be diligent on that. Is like whenever the opportunity comes up that I would normally send like maybe someone else's video, I'm going to make my own. And then that just helps to build the library there.
Yeah. And I've wrestled with that because I guess when I first started, I thought, all right, I'm going to record all the videos myself, either of me or of my girlfriend for like the lower body stuff that I can't do. And I quickly realized, so now my database is like 1,200 videos long, just, 20 different versions of a squat, like any type of squat that I've ever prescribed. They're all just random YouTube. Well, let me say this. They're not random YouTube videos because they're not just the first search result that comes up. I'll sometimes go through 6 pages of videos until I find the exact one I want. Yeah. And at that point, I probably should have just filmed it. It would have been faster. But I kind of rationalize it by thinking, well, if it's a female client, I sometimes like to show a female doing the exercise. Not that there are male and female exercises, but just so they can see it in a female body. Right. And then I also like the idea of showing, if there's 8 exercises in the program and I've gotten YouTube videos from 8 different people, it just shows different bodies performing the exercises as opposed to my body, the way that it looks on me every time. So in my mind, there's a little bit of laziness because if it's already out there, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I will reinvent the wheel if I can't find what I'm looking for. But if something's already been done and it looks like the way I want it to look, I can rationalize using it for those other reasons.
Right. Yeah, and I mean I think it's a little bit of both. Like there's going to be some time where it just makes more sense I'm sitting down, I'm at my home doing like my paperwork, and I have to send someone some information. I'm not going to wait 24 hours where I could just send that there. But whenever the time comes, I'm trying to do that more. And a lot of times, like I was sending stuff I had already done myself. Like, and I didn't even want to go to my own YouTube page to find it. Right. Like I was just the quickest thing that would pop up, I would send it. And it's just like, and I've already done this work, and it helps to, get more views on the video, but it also just helps my clients know that like they may have no savviness with the internet or YouTube, that I do have a YouTube channel. So look a little, they can look deeper into that, and then that could start to lead to other conversations.
Right. But that's where you said it is helpful to have your own system in place even for finding your archives of YouTube, because you might not remember what you titled it. So yeah, that's always a challenge for me, because I'm like, I know I did this, but I have no idea what I called it. I'm not even sure if I took the time to put it on YouTube. So now what? But yeah, now I try to be better if I do film something. Even if it's not for like general purposes, I'll put it on YouTube anyway, just so that I know that it's there in case I need it later. But admittedly, like, because I don't have a gym, some of the stuff just is in my like just right in my office or right in my dingy basement gym, which isn't the best, as if I had gone to the gym where I go and filmed it there. But I'm in between things, I guess you could say, in terms of like wanting it to be me, but wanting it to look professional versus wanting like it being clear that I'm just at my
Right.
house, you know?
Right. Yeah. And there's always that, and I go back and forth too with saying like, how much time do I want to put into editing versus how much content do I just want to get up?
Yeah.
Especially because I don't have the staff to kind of make that a little bit more streamlined. But I'm trying to have like some like standards of at least sound quality more now. And then just taking my time, like scheduling things out. Like, so if I do a bunch of videos, like don't put them up right away, but like take some time when I have the time to put them on a schedule, because then I won't have to think about it for a couple months. And then that's an easier thing for me to get some room, like to do that over and over again instead of feeling like I have to put some up every day.
Yeah, and so I can definitely appreciate like the sound quality on your recent videos has improved since years ago, uh,
Yeah.
and that does make a difference. And then yeah, the idea if I'm gonna film a bunch of videos today, I can trickle them out over time, and that's a way to keep consistent contact with my people who are on my email list. Show that I'm continually producing stuff and not just like spotty here and there.
Right. All right, man. Good talk. It's always great talking.